Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Chess DNA, and in this video we are continuing the series of Bobby Fischer's famous book, My 60 Memorable Games, and yesterday we covered the game 11. Today we have the game 12 from the book against a strong, very strong grandmaster from Serbia, Gligorić. And this is again from 1959 Candidates Tournament, and Fischer is just very young competing against these monsters. And this time there is no surprise. The game starts with e4 and c5 again, the Sicilian Defense. And this game is obviously very interesting to learn from. A spoiler alert, it's a draw. But it doesn't mean that it's not interesting. Our point of, learning from these Fischer's videos is not only to appreciate that how great Fischer was and enjoy his great attacks and victories, but also to learn from his games. And if Fischer drew a game, we need to understand what he did wrong. After all, he's a human as well. By the way, Spain just drew against Cabo Verde. I don't even know how to pronounce the name of that country in this FIFA World Cup. But still an interesting game. So this game is also just like that. Very interesting to learn from, although ended up in a draw. But let's dive right into it. So knight f3 and we have d6. And of course, no surprise in Bobby Fischer's response here, going for the Sicilian Najdorf. And if you're a Najdorf player, you should be playing d6 here. If you're not a Najdorf player, you should be playing like knight c6. If you're a dragon player or anything else, you can go for an e6 Sicilian setup. There's so many Sicilians, but d6 should be your choice if you're a Najdorf player. d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, and a6. So that's the bread and butter of Bobby Fischer. He always played it. There was only very few opportunities or games when he actually didn't play the Najdorf, but that was his favorite opening by far. Bishop g5, the most challenging line against the Najdorf. You immediately want to put the bishop to g5 with a quick f4, and Bobby Fischer later started playing the poisoned pawn variation with queen b6 and grabbing the pawn on b2, and that is also very super complex. But in this, immediately you have to go e6. And this is also important to understand why you go e6 and not e5, which you usually do in the Najdorf. Important theme to remember is that whenever white goes for either bishop c4 or bishop g5, you put the pawn on e6. Every other case or scenario, you go e5, because you cannot weaken the d5 square too much if the bishop comes out to c4. You want to be playing e6 to contest that bishop. That would be the Fischer-Sozin variation. And if bishop goes to g5, again, e5 would just weaken the d5 square too much. And in future, this knight could land on d5, putting a lot of pressure on this knight on f6, which is not ideal for black. So you want to be controlling that d5 square a lot of times, using the knight, using the pawn, just so this knight is not allowed to get there. So e6, very important, by the way. White goes f4, and then Fischer goes for bishop e7. Now, this is where you could just go queen b6 and head in towards the poisoned pawn variation, hitting the pawn on b2, and white just goes queen d2, welcomes black to take the pawn here, and then goes like rook b1, and then like queen a3, and then black is a pawn up, but white gets very nice compensation in the form of activity. And this is what Fischer later decided to do against this line. But here he was very young, wanted to just play his lines, whatever he knew, so he just unpins his knight, bishop to e7. Queen to f3 and queen to c7, another important move here. You might be wondering why not put the knight on d7 or c6, but it's really important to not let that light square bishop get that c4 post and then settle back at b3, because then there will be too much pressure on e6, and knight d7, there is usually a sacrifice on the e6 square. So you want to start with queen c7, hitting that or taking control of that c4 square, so you're not letting that bishop just chill at c4. And Gligorić castles here, long castles, of course, because the idea for white is to just launch all these pawn storm, all these pawns in the form of a pawn storm on the king's side. And if Fischer castles, then his king is going to be under tremendous pressure. Meanwhile, Fischer's idea would be to counterattack with a pawn storm on the queen side and try to go after White's king. In these Sicilians, opposite side castle Sicilians, it's usually the speed of the attack which determines the winner. And really, it is sometimes a gamble. If you're desperately in a must-win situation, you should be going for a Sicilian where opposite side castling takes place, and you just wanna swing your sword at your opponent swings his sword at you, and if they miss and you hit them, you win. And if you miss, they hit you, they win. Of course, there is no room for draw. Very rarely, sometimes the game could end up in a draw, but usually it's the attack versus attack. So sometimes, or most times, it's just a decisive result. Unlike this one, in this game, it was a draw because Fischer actually played something really weird, which we are going to be talking about in a moment. First knight to d7 developing and g4. And Gligorić has already started a nice pawn storm on the king side here. And then b5 Fischer, he goes for a counterattack on the queen side. And here, bishop takes knight. I mean, you can do that. You can also just have some other moves like a3 to stop any kind of b4 immediately. Bishop g2 is a move that is very popular, developing the light square bishop on this diagonal and then threatening some kind of e5 stuff, and then the rook would be hanging. So these are all the moves, but this is like the old theoretically known move, bishop takes knight, and pawn takes. So, I mean, these are all possible options here. You can capture with the pawn, you can capture with the knight, you can capture with a bishop. All of these moves are theoretically possible and known. And Fischer, in the game 9, if you're following the series in the book, in the game 9, Fischer recaptured the bishop back with a knight. But here he decides to take back with a pawn, which is also a very well-known line. And the king actually gets a nice shelter behind all of these pieces and pawns. And usually the king stays in the center and the black just activates the rook on the g file. F5 immediately played by Gligorić, although it does come with a cost. You have these pawns, you want to be pushing them forward, so it's important to realize that F5 is the best move in the position because you are putting a ton of pressure on the E6 pawn here with a knight, with a pawn, and trying to basically blow open the position. But it does come with a cost of giving up the e5 square, so Fischer immediately plants his knight on the e5 square, hitting the queen. Queen goes to h3, and now we reach this position where I will really welcome you to guess the move, because if you're playing this position, like let's say if I'm playing this position, I would definitely think about like putting the bishop to b7, castling long if I'm trying to be creative, because I don't want to be castling short. All these pawns, the possibility of opening up the g file, the queen already there on the h file. I mean, I would never want to be castling short. I might think of castling long or keep the king in the center, something like that. Maybe just a quick counterattack with a b4 move. Queen b7 is a move that is recommended by the computer. Bobby Fischer, castle short. I mean, the title of this game in the book is Castling into It. So there's an attack that Gligorić is building on the king side here, and he's waiting for Fischer to castle the king side. So he's basically preventing Fischer from castling king side, and Fischer castles on the king side. This is amazing. And Fischer also writes in the book that while he played this move, Tal and Tigran Petrosyan, who were both world champions later, Petrosyan, obviously one of the greatest players of all time, gives a weird wry sort of expression, as if like, what? Like, you can play like this and survive this? So he really gave like a weird look at Fischer after he saw these castles and is like, I mean, what is going on? How would you survive after castling short? And Fischer is like, did he do that to impress Petrosyan? Obviously not. This is Candidates, one of the most important tournaments in your life at a very young age. You don't want to be impressing some dude who's walking by. You want to be winning the game, of course. But the assessment that Fischer actually has here is that he wants to have the bishop pair in the long term. And he assesses that his king's weakness is only temporary, and he will just tuck his king away on the h8 square, and the knight is very well placed on e5, and the potential that he has with the bishop pair is going to compensate, and later he's going to build up an attack. But Gligorić has other plans. He first puts his knight on the e2 square just so he could just remaneuver it to the f4 square and put a lot of pressure on the e6 pawn here. And Fischer does tuck his king on the h8 square, knight f4, and rook to g8. Now the rook is at least doing great here, at least acting as a defender as well as an aggressor on the g file. And in this position, Gligorić also plays rook to g1. He says that in the book that bishop to e2 is probably more accurate move that you could have played here, with the idea to play the rook to e1 and then just trying to open the position up and wait for the perfect moment to attack. But Gligorić here actually plays rook to g1, and Fischer strikes right in the center with d5, the thematic move in the Sicilian. Whenever you think that you can play d5 in the Sicilian, get away with it, you should do it. And here he has the opportunity and he goes for it. So Gligorić first takes on e6 and Fischer grabs the pawn on e4. The position is, as you guys can see, getting more and more complex. It's so hard to analyze this, all the possibilities. So there's so many, like 5 or 6 moves that you can have with white here. The game can go in any direction. So we really have to just sit back and enjoy what Gligorić does here. Like you can think about moves like e takes f7, possibility of recapturing back with a knight. Then there's a possibility of knight d5, there's a possibility of rook g3, there's a possibility of bishop g2. Now so many moves you can play with different ideas. Gligorić goes for immediate attack on the queen and the bishop, stripping Fischer off the bishop pair here. Queen to c5, you have to move the queen and keep the bishop defended. So queen to c5, the only move. And here Gligorić makes a little inaccurate move of capturing this bishop. First, I mean, the accurate way would have been to first capture the pawn on f7 and force this knight to recapture back on f7, and only then grab the bishop. Queen takes, and the knight is a little bit more passive on f7 instead of being on e5, and the queen's not on f7. If like what happened in the game, for example, you eliminate the bishop first, queen takes, and if now you take this pawn, then queen takes, and queen has targets, and the knight is well placed in e5, and this is why this is a much better line for black here. But Gligorić after this does not take the pawn on f7, but first knight f5, hitting the queen, and now queen takes the pawn on e6. Again, it requires very careful calculation and judgment to play like this. You capture a pawn, you're inviting a rook to d6, and the queen is almost running out of squares here. But first queen to h6 was played by Gligorić. And why this move is played is, again, he's setting up a little threat or a trap. Like, you might think that this pawn on g4 is protecting the knight. So how about you just, like, I mean, you have a knight hitting that, you have a rook hitting that. So how about you just take that knight with a pawn with a knight, and you're hitting the queen. Well, Fischer has still not developed the light square bishop. So I mean, in this position, first you can play rook takes g4. Eliminating that knight, and this rook, which is now was responsible for recapturing back, would recapture, and then because of the weak back rank, rook to d1 check, rook to d8 check, and then rook g8, and then queen to g7 would be mate, and this rook is pinned, cannot capture it back. So amazing line there, that it's also indicating a little trap that Gligorić sets here if knight takes g4, but obviously Fischer is not going to fall for that. So he just improves the bishop to d7 and kills off that idea, improves the back rank, and but still the rook to d6 is played, and the queen is just under some tremendous pressure here. Knight takes on g4 now, rook takes, and Fischer takes the knight on f5. And rook takes rook on g8, and Fischer was a couple of pawns up, but now Gligorić grabs one pawn back and attacks the queen to d5. He repeats the position here, but Fischer has no choice but to just, keep in touch with the bishop, and he repeats it for now, and Gligorić just plays rook f6 again. So if Fischer goes queen to d5 again, then it would be a draw by repetition. But Fischer is just a very young, ambitious player who always wants to win. He never wants to settle for a draw. And he plays here queen to g5 check, forcing the trade of queens and going into this awkward endgame when you have your opponent's rook and king more active than your rook and the king. But Fischer is hoping that Gligorić might just feel a little bit uncomfortable playing it, because whenever you decline somebody's approach to a draw and you show them that you want to continue to play for a win, it does put some psychological pressure on your opponent. So maybe he was hoping for Gligorić to crumble under pressure, but Gligorić is obviously much more experienced than Fischer at this point, and he is hoping for Fischer to collapse and use the fact that he's not so experienced. So bishop to g4 here, Fischer improves the bishop, and king to d2, bishop to f3, supporting the pawn here, king to e3, and then he hits the bishop on f1 with rook g1, bishop to h3, and gives a check on e1, king goes to f4, goes after the c2 pawn with bishop to d1, king to e5. Now you can see the relative activity of White's king to the Black's king. It's amazing that White's king is so well placed right in the center of the board. The rook is just absolutely marvelously placed on the 7th rank. It looks like the White should be doing all right here, but technically it should still be a draw with perfect play. But obviously, from a practical standpoint, it is much harder to play with black pieces here, with your king just absolutely out of the game. So Fischer goes e3, and also the reason that Fischer might have some hope is this pass pawn that is so close to promotion, so he starts pushing it forward. But now bishop to f5, and you're putting a lot of pressure on h7 here. Rook to g1, and then Gligorić grabs that pawn on h7 with a check, king g8. And then he moves the rook to c7, defending the pawn on c2, which was under attack by the bishop one more time. Bishop to g4, offering a trade of bishops, and the bishops got off the board. And here Fischer starts to play instantly. He writes in the book that he just wants to play. He thinks it's a dead draw, and he just, plays it instantly, almost every move, blitzing it out. Gligorić does the right thing of putting the rook behind the pass pawn. You want to be controlling that pass pawn from behind it. Rook to g2, and here rook king to d4. Fischer here, if he grabs the pawn on h2, then Gligorić will play king to d3. And now if you promote to a queen, Gligorić would be threatening to take the pawn and offer a trade of rooks. By the way, this is winning for White now, because if, for example, you just do anything, it's black to move. Let's say you make a queen, rook takes e1, 3 versus 2 on the queen on side, and the position of the black king and the rook is just completely is just out of the game, and White would just have the rook to e6, start putting pressure on these pawns, create a passer, and they use the king to just push these pawns forward, obviously winning for White. And for that reason, it's really important for Fischer to first make a queen, drag that rook to the e file, and then take the c2 pawn instead of the h2 pawn. And now Gligorić defends his pawn on g2, and Fischer has no time again to capture the pawn on h2, because then White's king will have easier time to get into the game, collect these pawns, and have 2 versus 0 basically on the queen side. So you don't want to be allowing that infiltration to the White king, although it's still okay to do it, but Fischer improves the position of the king first. A3 here, and king to e6, b3 here, and now finally Fischer grabs a pawn on h2 when his king is much better placed on e6. King to c5, king to d7, king to b6, and now Fischer goes after the a pawn here. Gligorić grabs the pawn on a6. Fischer grabs on a3 with a check, and Gligorić does not take the pawn on b5. I mean, he can, but then it would be a straightforward draw. But he just wants to maybe again hope for Fischer to make a mistake when he wants to keep the position a little bit more complex and complicated. Whenever you just dive deep into the game, let's say 50 moves in, you are already exhausted, tired, your stamina is running out, you're already thinking about what to eat and have a good sleep tonight, and you just want to get off the board and shake hands with your opponent. So sometimes grinding, just continuing to playing on. And if you have better stamina than your opponent, you might be getting rewarded for that, which is what Magnus always does. He just keeps on playing, and his opponents just collapse after being subjected to a lot of pressure. So he plays king b7. I mean, he knows that this pawn is not going anywhere. He could always grab it. So he just plays a little bit of cat and mouse with Fischer here. And in this position, Fischer just plays king d6 again, blitzing out. He writes that in his book that he just plays these moves so fast and pressing the clock just because he's super sure that it is a draw. And king b6 and king d7 again, and b4, and then rook to h3, and then rook to c1, and then rook to h8. A big blunder by Fischer. And that's what happens when you're blitzing out. Sometimes you're overconfident. I mean, Fischer is very young in 1959. Of course, he learns from his mistakes at this point of his career. And then in order to become the best player of all time later, he has to commit some mistakes to learn from. And he also writes that after the game, another player, Olafsson, who has a game that we featured in the series as well, started to scold Fischer. Like, he goes to Fischer and tells him that, how can you play this position so fast without wasting any time on the clock? Like, it does have complexities and ability to blunder so much, and you should be investing some time. And Fischer was like, it was a dead draw. But he shows Fischer that no, there was a moment in the game when Gligorić could have won the game. Fischer goes back home, analyzes this rook endgame all night long, and then learns a lot about it. And then he does admit to the fact that, yeah, this rook h8 was a blunder, and Gligorić could have won the game with rook c7 check. Like, what do you do here? If king d6, you have, you can go rook c6 check. If king d7 back, now you can grab this pawn. And if you give this check, then a rook blocks. And like, this is winning for white because you just step out with a king and then you're promoting the pawn. And how to assess these rook and pawn end games? I mean, it is definitely very hard. There is no, like, very little, at least, rule of thumbs that you have to do this if this that. No, you have to rely a lot upon your calculation, a lot upon your intuition, and you have to gain a ton of experience in these to luckily play the right move. Sometimes even the best, like Bobby Fischer, if he's blundering the rook endgame like this, then obviously we are no ones to claim that, okay, I'm an expert in the rook and endgame. I mean, this is always a gamble. I mean, they should introduce the rook and pawn endgame in blitz format in casinos, that if you want to bet your money, you should play the rook and pawn endgame for a draw or a win. And sometimes you will draw, sometimes you will win, and you might lose your money, you might actually make more money. So it's always a gamble. I mean, of course, not a gamble at the top level. These guys are training super hard every day, building a lot of experience in the rook and pawn endgames, and also using their calculation ability. But at anywhere less than like master level, it's usually always luck that helps you win or draw these rook and pawn endgames. Sometimes you're blundering and your opponents are not even seeing that. Like here, one of the best players in the world, Gligorić, does not see the winning continuation here, rook c7. And that's what psychological pressure can do to you. Fischer is instantly playing this, kind of gives this false sense of security to Gligorić as well, that Fischer is so confident that he's just blitzing out. So probably it is a draw. He cannot blunder, right? He's a strong player. He cannot blunder playing candidates. Unbelievable that he actually grabbed the pawn here, after which Fischer gave rook to b8 check, king a4, another check, king back to b3, and now he offers a trade of rooks. And after this, king to c4 is played. And in this position, one last puzzle for you guys. There's only one move that black has to play in order to draw this. Every other move is losing. So you can pause and try to figure out the move that Fischer played in this position, and the players shook hands and agreed to a draw. Because I'm going to reveal it. If you found king c7, you're wrong. Because king c7 will allow white to win opposition with king c5. Now, if you go king b7, then king b5. And if you step away to king to a7, then white outflanks and then again wins opposition and again outflanks and rolls the red carpet for the pawn to promote itself. So definitely you don't want to be letting your opponent win the opposition here. And also, if you go king to b7, then again, white can win opposition with king to b5. And it's a similar position. You outflank your opponent in the similar fashion and let your pawn. But this is like a very trivial, basic pawn, king and pawn endgame that both players, of course, would solve correctly, even if they're half asleep, even if they're high, doesn't matter. Like, the king to b8 is the drawing move, because if white wants to win opposition, he will have to step on his pawn, which the pawn would not like. And that's not possible. So, I mean, if now king goes to b5, then king b7, black wins opposition, and you just maintain the status quo here. And like, whatever you do here, you just have to be careful. You have to drop the king not to c8, because again, this would be winning for white. So you want to be stepping once again to b8 here. Very important endgame knowledge. that you have to know in order to draw, because now in the end it's a stalemate. It is black to move, but black doesn't have a legal move, so it's called a stalemate, and the game would have ended in a draw. But Gligorić, of course, shook hands. He understands that Fischer already knows it, and nobody understands that Gligorić missed a win at this point, and Gligorić never realized that later. He wrote a book on this book as well, covered this game, and never realized that he missed a win. Of course, at that point, there was no computers or stuff, so they would never know if they really blundered or anything. But definitely in this position, after Fischer's analysis, he realized that, okay, he did fumble it up, and Gligorić did have a win, but he never realized it. Anyways, there's a lot to learn from this game. A Najdorf, very complex game to analyze from. So this video did get a lot longer than the other usual videos, but I hope you guys learned a lot. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for me to motivate me enough to make the next video for you guys in the series, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.